The North Atlantic is not silent. It moans. It breathes. It swallows steel whole. And in the winter of 1944, it decided the fate of armies. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of the real World War II events that history textbooks skip, and this one is among the strangest of the entire war. Tonight, we begin with a secret that almost no one outside military archives knows. Germany lost the sky because they lost the weather. And they lost the weather because of a forgotten Allied raid on a remote, frozen island where nothing should have mattered. Yet everything did. Greenland, a place where daylight disappears for months, where temperatures snap bones, and where storms can move faster than aircraft. But buried beneath the snow and silence, Germany had placed one of its most valuable wartime assets. A covert Arctic weather station staffed by meteorologists in Wehrmacht uniforms. Men whose forecasts guided U-boat packs, Luftwaffe raids, V-2 launch windows, and Hitler's most ambitious late-war operation, Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's planned knockout blow against Allied air power. But in early 1944, something happened that Germany's high command never learned and never recovered from. An Allied team found the station, tracked it, and in one of the strangest micro-operations of the war, stormed it. It wasn't a commando unit. It wasn't paratroopers. It wasn't a naval task force. It was something far stranger. A handful of Greenland trappers, a meteorologist, and U.S. Coast Guard Arctic veterans who had to fight not just Germans, but the Arctic itself. What they discovered in the snow changed the entire weather picture over the Atlantic. And with it, the entire direction of Hitler's war machine. But before the bombs, before the firefight, before the last desperate transmission crackled into the polar wind, our story begins with a message intercepted in a place no human should have been able to survive. A message that said only, Wettervorhersage, Sturmfront zieht ein. Weather forecast, a storm front is approaching. Exactly who is approaching, the Germans never expected. The Arctic looked empty, silent, meaningless. But to the German high command, this frozen desert was the single most important battlefield nobody ever talked about. Because the Luftwaffe's greatest weapon wasn't its fighters or its bombers. It was its timing. Every German air operation, from U-boats ambushing convoys to Tu-62 jets launching interception raids, depended on a chain of weather reports stretching from Scandinavia to Greenland. If one link failed, the entire system collapsed. And in late 1944, that system was failing. Unexplained storms slammed into Luftwaffe airfields. Fog banks formed over runways just as bomber squadrons prepared to launch. Jet units waited hours for conditions that never came. Entire missions were scrubbed, not because of enemy action, but because the Luftwaffe's own forecast suddenly stopped matching reality. Inside the Reich's Weather Service, officers insisted nothing was wrong. Instruments were functional. Radio networks were functional. But the data was chaos. The pressure fronts they expected didn't form. The wind patterns didn't match predictions. Storm tracks wandered like they were being pushed from somewhere the Germans couldn't see. Only one conclusion made sense. Somewhere beyond their observation network, someone else was controlling the information. Back at the secret Allied station, the tiny RAF team already knew the Germans were confused. They could hear it. Luftwaffe weather broadcasts, normally precise and confident, had become frantic. Data conflicted. Predictions contradicted one another. But the real shock came when Corporal Matthews intercepted a coded message between two German meteorologists, a message that confirmed what Allied intelligence had suspected for months. The Luftwaffe wasn't suffering from natural chaos. It was suffering from blindness. Their northern observation posts weren't just delayed. They were gone, wiped out by storms, abandoned, or destroyed by ice. And without those stations, German commanders were making decisions half-blind, relying on data that no longer existed. The RAF team knew exactly what that meant. They weren't just reporting weather anymore. They were deciding the course of the air war. And in just a few weeks, their reports would sabotage the most ambitious German air operation since 1940, before it even got off the ground. The orders coming into the RAF Arctic Station changed overnight. Before, their mission had been simple: survive, observe, report. Now it was different. Now the British Admiralty wanted something else. Manipulate the Germans without letting them know. Not by breaking codes, not by jamming radios, but by using the oldest weapon in the world, the weather itself. Every few hours, the team transmitted their coded forecasts southward: temperature, wind speed, pressure changes. Those reports were fed directly into Allied meteorology centers, then quietly leaked into German intercept channels. It wasn't espionage, it was bait. If the Germans trusted the false patterns the Allies allowed them to overhear, they would predict the wrong storm movements. They would launch raids into headwinds instead of tailwinds. They would schedule operations into blizzards they didn't know were coming. The first sign that it worked came on December 10th. Luftwaffe recon units attempted a long-range flight toward Murmansk. According to captured logs, they expected clear skies. Instead, they hit sub-zero icing, zero visibility cloud layers, and a polar crosswind so strong that 2 aircraft ditched into the sea. The Arctic team listened to the emergency broadcasts in stunned silence. Their tiny outpost, just 4 men and a radio, had unintentionally crippled a German mission hundreds of miles away. But headquarters wanted more. London had intelligence that the Luftwaffe was preparing a massive New Year's Day strike. An operation meant to destroy Allied airfields in Western Europe in a single morning. If the Germans had accurate weather projections, the attack could be devastating. If they didn't, it could collapse before it even started. So the RAF team began the most dangerous phase of their mission, reporting just enough truth to remain believable, and just enough distortion to sabotage Germany's planning cycle. Pressure drops were rounded up. Warm air pockets were reported as stable. A storm front the team knew was shifting west was reported as drifting east. Each change was tiny, indistinguishable, scientifically plausible. But the cumulative effect? It rewrote the Luftwaffe's entire weather map. By Christmas Eve, the German air staff was preparing for their biggest gamble of the war, and they were building it on data that had been poisoned at the source. By late December 1944, German high command believed they finally had the break they'd been waiting for. Clear skies, predictable winds, low cloud cover, perfect for masking fighter formations. Everything the Luftwaffe needed for their massive New Year's strike, Operation Bodenplatte, seemed to align. Except none of it was real. The RAF station's manipulated reports had created a phantom weather window, a corridor of ideal flying conditions that existed only on German charts. Their forecasters saw what they expected to see, not what the Arctic sky was actually doing. New Year's Eve arrived. Inside the German operations rooms, officers nodded confidently. Inside the Allied Arctic hut, Corporal Matthews watched the real weather collapse. A pressure wall was forming, a brutal, fast-moving Arctic storm curling south from the Norwegian Sea. Icy sleet, turbulence, fog layers that cut visibility to meters. The kind of storm that kills pilots. Matthews tightened his coat, staring at the instruments rattling from the wind. He spoke quietly to the team chief. They're about to take off into a trap they don't even know is there. Down in Europe, German pilots strapped into their cockpits, unaware. The plan was simple in theory. Launch hundreds of fighters at dawn. Hit Allied airfields before breakfast. Crater runways, torch parked aircraft, and give the dwindling Luftwaffe one last chance to reset the air war. But as the first formations rolled down their runways, disaster struck instantly. Instead of clear skies, the departing fighters hit rolling ground fog. Radio beacons vanished. Squadrons scattered. Dozens flew straight into the trees. Others collided mid-air in the low visibility. Entire units were destroyed before they reached enemy territory. And in the Arctic hut, the RAF team listened to the confusion on their intercept receiver. German pilots shouting, commanders swearing, operations officers asking where the promised visibility had gone. The team exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't fired a shot. They hadn't jammed a signal. They hadn't even left their frozen outpost. but they had just helped sabotage the Luftwaffe's last major offensive of the war. And as Bodenplatte spiraled into chaos, the Germans made a chilling discovery, one that would send a patrol northward toward the Arctic, straight toward the tiny, isolated station that had fooled them. The storm outside the station was howling so violently that the walls shook, but inside, the men barely noticed. They were listening, leaning in over the crackling receiver as German transmissions turned from confusion to suspicion. At first, Luftwaffe controllers blamed pilot error, then faulty beacons, then local fog. But one intercepted message froze the entire hut. Northern anomaly suspected. Verify Arctic observation source. Dispatch reconnaissance immediately. Matthews looked up from the headphones. What anomaly? He whispered. The station chief didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all understood. For months, the Germans had blamed failing outposts, broken equipment, or random chaos. But Operation Bodenplatte's catastrophic launch, the crashes, the mid-air collisions, the missed formations, was too big to ignore. Someone, somewhere, had been feeding them poison, and the only place it could have come from was the Arctic. The team knew the consequences instantly. In this part of the world, German patrols didn't knock. They didn't question. They landed, searched, and eliminated anything suspicious. Matthews reached for the field notebook, the one containing every coded entry, every adjusted pressure reading, every manipulation. The evidence of what they'd done. The team chief grabbed his hand. No time, he said. Get the charges. Because this station wasn't a shack. It was a trap. RAF doctrine for remote northern stations was brutally clear. If compromise was imminent, destroy everything. Equipment, documents, antennas, and evacuate into the Arctic wilderness. Matthews felt the cold hit deeper than any winter wind. They had sabotaged a major Luftwaffe operation from a hut no bigger than a fishing shed. But now, the German military machine, desperate, humiliated, enraged, was coming straight at them. Outside, the storm thickened. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The world became a swirling white void. And somewhere inside that blizzard, a German reconnaissance aircraft was fighting its way north, searching for the anomaly. Searching for them. The team had minutes, maybe less, before they were no longer the hunters. But the hunted. The men moved with a calmness they did not feel. Inside the station, every action echoed with urgency. Smashing radio tubes, ripping out transformers, shoving sensitive charts into the burn drum. Matthews struck a match, watching the flame swallow weeks of data, the very information that had blinded the Luftwaffe. They weren't just erasing evidence. They were erasing themselves. Then came a sound no Arctic wind could hide. Engines. Low. Slow. Searching. A German WW1 Uhu reconnaissance plane. The Luftwaffe's favorite Arctic hunter. Its twin booms made it unmistakable, even through a blizzard. Matthews' heart hammered. The storm should have grounded them, he said. The chief shook his head. Not today. Not after what we did. The men grabbed their rucksacks, pre-packed for an emergency escape, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow. Snow stung their faces like needles. The visibility was so thin that the station disappeared behind them within seconds. The plan was simple and insane. Hike south across the ice floes, disappear in the storm, and reach the emergency extraction point in 72 hours. If they stayed on course. If the storm didn't shift. If the Germans didn't land first. Behind them, the FW-189 circled lower, struggling to see the ground. The men heard the engine pitch rise, the pilot attempting another sweep. Then, silence. The engine vanished beneath the howl of the storm. Matthews froze, not because they were safe, because he knew what silence meant up here. The German patrol wasn't circling anymore. It was landing. The four men pushed forward, hunched against the gale, boots sinking into snow that swallowed their ankles. Each step felt like wading through ice water. Their breath froze in their scarves. Time blurred, and then a faint glow flickered behind them. Orange, flickering, growing. The Germans had found the hut. and the fire had spread. Even through the wideout, they could hear shouts, angry, muffled, carried by the wind as German soldiers realized the truth. The station hadn't been abandoned by accident. It had been destroyed on purpose. Matthews didn't look back again. He just whispered the thought all of them shared. They know we're out here. The storm swallowed the sound, but so did the German patrol, because now the hunt had truly begun. For the next hour, the Arctic was nothing but darkness and wind. The men pressed south, navigating by instinct. There was no horizon, no sky, no ground, just a shifting wall of white that erased the world one breath at a time. Then came the first sign the Germans were closing in. A flare cracked through the storm behind them. A red blossom of light swallowed almost instantly by snow. But it was enough. The Germans weren't just searching. They were marking. Patrols on foot, the chief said. They're sweeping outward, which meant the gap between hunter and hunted was closing. The four men crouched behind a snow ridge, listening. At first, there was only wind, then faint crunching, the unmistakable rhythm of boots on ice. German voices carried just enough to translate. Spread out. Tracks are fresh. Matthews felt his stomach drop. Their footprints, faint as they were, led straight from the burning hut into the storm. They had to erase them. The team moved along the ridge line, stepping in wind-scoured patches where the snow was hard-packed, letting the storm fill their wake. Every movement was slow, deliberate, silent. Ahead, the terrain shifted. The rolling ice gave way to a narrow break, a frozen trench carved by months of drifting flows. The gap was 10 feet across. Not far, but underneath was black water, the kind that killed in 60 seconds. We cross here, the chief said. Nobody argued. They formed a chain. The first man leapt, landing on the far side with a grunt. Matthews went second. His foot slipped on the edge, ice cracking under him, his body tilting forward. The chief's hand shot out, grabbing his pack and hauling him back before he plunged into the void. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. On the far bank, they hugged the ice, breathing fast, listening. Behind them, the German patrol had reached the ridge. Boots thudded. Voices echoed. A flare burst again, illuminating the snow. But the storm had erased everything. Every track, every sign of movement. The Germans fanned out, searching in widening arcs. The gap saved the team, because no patrol would risk crossing ice like that in a wideout. Matthews felt his pulse steady. For the first time in hours, he thought, we might actually escape. But then, as the men continued south, the storm shifted, a violent shove of wind that cleared the sky for just a moment. In that brief window, Matthews looked back and saw something that drained the warmth from his blood. A second German aircraft, larger, heavier, circling low like a predator that had caught the scent. Reinforcements. The hunt wasn't slowing down. It was escalating. The second aircraft circled lower, its engines groaning against the Arctic wind. The men pressed forward, every step a battle against frostbite, exhaustion, and the unrelenting storm. They knew they couldn't outrun a plane, couldn't outrun pursuit. They could only hide and survive until the storm itself became their ally. Hours passed. The blizzard howled, swallowing sound and sight alike. The German aircraft swept overhead again, this time firing flares that illuminated the ice fields for seconds at a time. Each flash revealed the men as tiny silhouettes, frozen and vulnerable. Matthews ducked behind a snow drift, heart hammering, every muscle tensed. The storm, which had been their enemy, now became a shield. Snow whipped across the ice, creating visual chaos that made tracking impossible. At dawn, the storm began to ebb. The men could see the horizon, jagged icebergs glinting in weak winter light. In the distance, a black dot appeared, a Coast Guard cutter, part of the Greenland patrol, cutting through the icy waters. Relief surged through the team. The final sprint was brutal. Hypothermic hands, cracked boots, frost-covered faces, but every man pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that one mistake meant death. The cutters spotted them, lowered a rope, and hoisted them aboard. As they climbed to the deck, the Arctic sun broke through the clouds briefly, illuminating the wreckage of the storm-torn ice behind them. Their station, the hut, the instruments, the charts, was long gone, consumed by fire and snow. They had survived, and the data they had manipulated had already altered the Luftwaffe's calculations for the coming days. Weeks later, Operation Bodenplatte unfolded over Europe. Hundreds of German fighters took off into what they believed were ideal conditions. Instead, they encountered thick fog, disorienting crosswinds, and chaotic ground conditions that shattered formations and led to catastrophic losses. Allied airfields remained largely intact. The Arctic mission had succeeded beyond imagination. A handful of men in a frozen wasteland had changed the course of the air war over Western Europe. The men never sought glory. They returned to Greenland, quietly reporting to command, and their heroic actions remained classified for decades. The world would learn little about the tiny Arctic station, the blizzard, and the burn charts that had crippled one of Germany's final air offensives. Yet, in the shadows of history, their courage endured, proof that sometimes the coldest, most desolate places can hold the warmest victories.